Thank you very much, and thanks for this extraordinary introduction. It's pretty difficult to live up to this kind of thing, and I will try my best. Incidentally, this lecture was advertised as something by a renowned French anthropologist, Pascal Boyer. I don't know if I'm renowned, but I know that I'm American. And as American as apple pie, although this particular pie is of recent baking, but I'm very happy of it anyway. And since I spent most of my life in Britain, it's not terribly French, what I'm going to say. And I want to emphasize that because just in case some people here were expecting some Foucauldian, postmodernist musings on creativity and culture, this talk might be slightly disappointing, if not altogether offensive. So I want to approach these things not in terms of individual creativity, what makes some people exceptional, but in terms of biological human evolution. You know, how did we get to the point that we have millions of people creating lots of cultural products all the time? And how is that possible in a species whose makeup was constrained by natural selection? The way I want to explain this is, or what I want to say about it today, is that in general, when we approach these things in anthropology or in the study of human evolution, we tend to have this idea that there is a sort of liberation event in the evolution of mankind from, other apes, that seems that the mind sort of broke free of its chain, of its shackles, and human behavior became, and sort of hominin behavior became human, cultural. Imagination and creativity are seen as a kind of liberation. The problem is that this liberation theme is very bad evolutionary anthropology. And the mind is not something that got created out of a miraculous event and that made it very different from what apes were doing with their cognitive systems. It's made of a great number of different systems that each do what they're supposed to do given their evolution by natural selection. Each of them has an evolved function. And each of those systems, I will talk about some of them, carries the potential for creative innovation. So in other words, what we have is liberation through adaptations. And I will try to substantiate this claim by talking about a few domains where this is, in my view, quite plausible or even completely true. I know this is a humanities talk, so I shouldn't use obscene words like that, but I do stand by this story. Now, I put all the plot here in one slide because I know that, because I've worked in psychological labs, so I know that people's attention after 2 minutes tends to wander. So this is all there is to it, okay? The rest are pretty pictures. So, why do we have this liberation theology, so to speak? This is a bad pun, but or bad play on words, but we do have this idea that until, say, 200,000 years ago, or until, up to 50,000 years ago, mental systems, even of hominins and Homo erectus, were pretty different from what they are now, or what they've been ever since. And we tend to think that there is one phenomenon that explains that, which is that there's a starting point of cognitive evolution. So, all the way up to that sort of cultural explosion that we see, depending on what you want to call the cultural explosion. It could be 200,000 years in Africa, or it could be 50,000 years in Europe. You have very high cognitive specialization of systems. Apes' brains and Homo brains seem to have lots of different systems that do different things, and that they're specialized in those things, but they don't seem to be doing much beyond that. In other words, the idea is that primitive, pre-human humans were very good at foraging, they were very good at mating, they were very good at warfare, but they couldn't do much besides they couldn't think outside the box, to put it in popular terms. And then a miracle occurs, which could be the development of general intelligence. Some people say, well, we used to have special intelligences, then we got something much more abstract, which is general intelligence. And we have this outburst of cultural creativity. Now, and then we get this sort of wonderful thing, which is from the Chauvet cave, that's 37,000 years ago. But how did the mind supposedly break free? Well, people have very complicated and often pretty vague answers to that, I think. Some of them, including, to some extent, Terry Deacon, who was speaking a while ago here, would say that symbolism is something that made the mind very different from what it used to be. People say, well, what we find at, say, 70 to 50,000 years ago is the sudden development of cultures. That is the idea that each group has very different norms and ways of doing things. You probably know about the history of the Acheulean axe, which is very, very nice axe that's humans made for about 1 million years without ever changing anything in it. Now, this sort of stability in human capacities changes all of a sudden, it seems, and humans start doing things that are just the local versions of an artifact, for example. But the problem is that this is largely vacuous. You know, what do we mean by culture such that it would have that power? And also, this doesn't tell us about anything about what the mind change was that supported the evolution of culture. Some people say that it's modern natural language that did it. That is, proto-languages of various kinds that we know of do not allow non-referential use. I mean, in the sense that, you know, the kind of language that we see in pigeons, for example, have great difficulty talking about anything else than the here and there. But modern languages do it. And complex syntax creates a common code for representations. That is, language is something that allows you to talk about sensory information from all sorts of different modalities in a common idiom. Maybe it's the development of imagination, maybe it's the development of memory and time travel, by which I mean mental time travel, not literal physical time travel. That's possible. We know, for example, that humans are a bit special in the fact that they can be sensitive to what happened in the past and very sensitive to what might happen in the future. And it doesn't seem to be the same for many other species. But again, the problem is that all this is way too vague. And it tells us that all we need is a magic bullet that will take us from this fellow who seems to have a longing. You know, you can see it in his face. He's trying to be something else. What is trying to be something else is this. But no, this is bad anthropology. There is no teleology there. And this guy on the left was never trying or even going towards being like this person. So we have to find something else that explains what happened that created, that triggered cultural creativity. The problem with liberation scenarios is that very often the magic bullet is not sufficient. Language is not sufficient for culture. In development, you find that lots of linguistic capacities predate people's capacity for imaginative play. And so sometimes the magic bullet is very vague or vacuous. You know, well, I wouldn't have said that if Terry Deacon was actually here, but he's not here, so I can say, what on earth is symbolism? Or how did culture beget culture? I mean, you know, people say, well, we acquired cultures when we were at 50 or 70,000 years ago. Yeah, that's right, but the basic problem is that cultures made us different. Yes, but how did they occur? But we have another problem with those liberation scenarios, which is that they have a problem of indirection. They don't tell us they don't explain what we want to understand. What we want to understand is not just why there is human culture or cultures. What we want to understand is why is it the way it is? Why there are cultural universals and quasi-universals, the things that you're very likely to encounter in lots of different cultures in the world. Why these particular recurrent themes? And I will try to explain what I mean by that we have this sort of elephant in the room, as it were, in anthropology, which is that human cultures do have enormous things in common that we want to explain and that we very often are not explaining in current anthropological frameworks. So we want to explain all this. Now, the alternative to the idea of a sudden event or a magic bullet is that we are the same as other species. We have many instincts, and instincts in the modern sense, not in the old sense of some automatic process, but mental systems that are dedicated to some adaptive problem. We have lots of those systems which are geared to solving adaptive problems like finding a mate, which is not a very easy thing to do if you don't have predisposition to select certain objects in the world as mates. So for foraging, which is a very complex mathematical problem to solve, you know, how to extract maximum resources from patchy environments, how to do warfare, which requires lots of coordination between people, how to organize cooperation, which also requires very complex processes. Now, none of these issues is solved by having lots of general intelligence. That is, the main specific problems like finding a mate or finding a better way of using your patchy environment to extract nutrients from it, these are very specific problems. If you try to apply the logic of foraging to mating, you would be in dire straits very quickly, because the mating environment is patchy, but not in the same way as the foraging environment. And also, the patches of nutrients in the environment do not resent it when you neglect them. But I have news for you. If you apply foraging to mating, it's not going to work. So we have domain-specific problems, and we have domain-specific principles that help us solve these recurrent problems. Which means that if we are a more complex species, and we are more complicated cognitively than rabbits, rabbits are more complicated than cockroaches, and cockroaches are more complicated than paramecia. That means that we don't have less instinct. That means that we have more instinct. And that's something that William James actually said. Humans are human because they have more instinct than other species. The Darwinian version of that is what these days people would call evolutionary psychology, which is that we have an extremely complex evolved psychology whose richness in terms of evolved dispositions and preferences is such that we can acquire vast amounts of information from the environment. In general, in evolution, you'll find that systems that acquire more information from the environment are the systems that have more information to start with. That is why if you want to design a cockroach, that may not be sort of super difficult. But if you want to design a rabbit, that's going to be much more challenging. And an ape is going to be more challenging, and a human is going to be even more challenging, because the operating system, so to speak, has to be vastly more complex to allow them to acquire vastly more information from the environment. Okay, so once you have this view of psychology, does it mean that we have an evolved psychology that is a kind of iron cage out of which we cannot think? Well, I don't think so. And I want to demonstrate that it's precisely because we have this very rich psychology that we have cultural creativity. So I consider sort of three domains that of the stuff that makes us proud to be human. You know, when we consider ourselves, we say, well, after all, we have fiction, for example, which is that we can think about worlds that do not actually exist, and we can be interested in people who do not exist. Also, something that should make us proud, in a way, is that we have nonsense ideologies. I will try to describe two of them, and not be too offensive about the fact that they are kind of nonsensical. But they demonstrate the fact that we can think nonsense shows how incredibly liberated we are. You know, because it seems to be that if our thought was strictly determined by what is around, we wouldn't have nonsense ideologies. Nonsense ideologies are proof of freedom, as it were. And I will try to show that they also show the influence of evolved psychology. Finally, religious ideas, because, you know, that's my trade. They seem to us that, very often it seems to us that this is something that shows how unconstrained the human mind is, because it creates things that are beyond any empirical experience. And again, I want to say, well, yes, but it's because it is severely constrained by our evolved psychology that it can do that. So, let us look at fiction. And this is the portrait of someone engaging in fictive imagination. Since I'm not teaching a class of undergraduates, I don't have to tell you that this is Marcel Proust, or I don't have to say that Marcel Proust was a famous writer of the beginning of the 19th. Oh, sorry, I didn't show the picture. Oh, sorry, so there's no joke there. There is no there, actually. Anymore. I apologize for that. The fact is that my computer shows these pictures ahead of what you can see, which is very misleading. So you have for no extra money, rehearsal of what I just said. Right, okay. So this is him. And he's a famous French writer of the last century. Now, I won't talk about what creates people like Marcel Proust as opposed to people like Henry James. I will talk about something vastly more mundane in a way, but also much more widespread, which is why on earth are humans interested in fiction? Why pay attention to the world of fiction in general? This is a universal interest. There is no place on earth that anthropologists have described where people do not create fictive worlds, stories, and pay attention to that. And they're interested. You know, it can be literate, highbrow literature of the kind we know, or folk tales and myths, and everyday sort of stuff that people make up, stories, accounts. People are interested in those things. There are some quasi-universals of fiction that the Russian formalists, for example, were terribly interested in, and that are not terribly sort of, well, literary studies don't seem to be interested in that anymore, but it's an interesting topic. I mean, there are ways in which most fictive stories seem to obey certain rules. There are also recurrent themes, you know, the soap opera kind of nature of most fiction in most societies, most of the time, is something that is difficult to ignore. And ever since Aristotle, people have been trying to understand why is it that this is interesting. And if you're a sort of biologically minded anthropologist, you'd say, what is in it for us? I mean, in what sense does that participate in our fitness? So why should the interest for fiction be naturally selected? So we see that, for example, when we see this scene that this fellow is reading, we all empathize. Of course, it's vastly more interesting to read the book than to have sex with a woman next to him. Of course it is. But empathizing is not enough. We have to explain why that is so obviously more interesting. And for anthropologists, one thing that is clear about humans is that they have hypertrophied social intelligence. People can tell you that lots of primates have social intelligence, they have lots of social inferences, but humans have a sort of monstrous amount of social intelligence and interest in social interaction. For example, this is the kind of this is the kind of thing that humans have no difficulty in parsing. And if you were in that situation, you would understand that, of course, it's true that Bob realized that Luke can believe that Pat didn't know that Sid has forgotten to tell Jack that. That is the sort of thought that we have. And we don't find that very difficult. If you try to get any other primate to entertain that amount of levels of meta-representation, you'll see that it very soon collapses. We also have the capacity for trustworthiness evaluation. We trust others, but we know how not to trust them and how to measure how much they're reliable as partners. We do coalitional reasoning, that is, we know how to build alliances, we know how to fight against other alliances and things like that. This is a very deep sort of domain of motivation for humans. We have very complex standards of fairness in our dealings with others. We depend enormously on social interaction, on social information, and that's why we have all these capacities. People have said that, you know, if you want to understand what is the domain, the milieu in which humans live, their milieu is information, and it's information provided by others. The milieu of whales is the sea, well, ours is information provided by other people. So that's why we have all these extremely sort of rich and sophisticated adaptations for social intelligence. Another sign of that is that we have an emotional interest in gossip. Again, there is no society in the world where people don't entertain gossip at the same time as saying that it's very bad, but also sort of providing lots of news and things like that way. So this is so important to us that it appears very, very early in development. I just want to give you a few sort of landmarks of what this is. 20-minute-old babies imitate complex facial faces from adults. And when we say 20 minutes, it means that's because psychologists can only test them at 20 minutes. Because, before that, annoyingly, the parents want to handle the baby. So we can't get there and say, okay, it's just out, let me sort of make faces and see how it imitates us. That's sort of, unfortunately, unethical. At 2 months, children react to direct gaze as opposed to indirect gaze. That is, if you look them in the eyes, they follow gaze, and so on and so forth. They start babbling. Turn-taking, for example, appears very, very early in people who are 6 months old, and therefore do not talk, but they do take turns. And they structure their exchange with people in terms of turn-taking. Then you have things like imperative and declarative pointing, which means that children know how to attract the attention of others and focus it by using this gesture. This is something that appears spontaneously around that age. Other things appear later, like pretend play, like an explicit desire-based theory of mind. Theory of mind is the term we use in the trade to describe all those inferences that people have in their mind about the way minds work, such that they can understand other people. People start having imaginary companions. They start understanding false beliefs in a way that is explicit, and so on and so forth. I spare you the details. The pretense capacity is something that arises pretty early. Like a banana as a phone or a soap bar as a car. Oh, sorry. When you do pretense, it seems like it's pretty easy to do that. Okay, to pretend that banana is a telephone. However, it's very difficult. And one thing that's very difficult about it is that you have to keep two distinct representations of the same object distinct so that you don't mix them. So if you think, for example, if you do the reverse and pretend that the telephone handle, for the young people, this is the way telephones used to look like. Some of you may not have seen these things, but that's, okay. If you treat the telephone like a banana and you say, oh, I've got a banana, you have to remember not to start munching it, because it's actually a telephone. So imagine in a 2-year-old's brain, you have to have this sort of constant interplay with these two sets of representations without mixing the inferences you can draw from them. This is pretty important. And this is also why some people don't manage it. Some patients don't manage it, and some species seem to be pretty bad at it. But to sum up, what we have is an intuitive psychology, that is an intuitive understanding of what it is that a mind is, such that other people have it. And it is constantly activated. It's mostly tacit and automatic. I cannot act in front of you without you having a mentalistic representation of what are the thoughts and desires that make me act. But also, it has it results in a certain theory of what people are like. A theory that is tacit, that we'd never make explicit, but that is directing our social interaction. For example, and this is something that appears very early in young children. Young children think that mental states are invisible, but they're real, and also that they're non-physical. So that it's possible, and some developmental psychologists have shown that for 3-year-olds there's absolutely no difficulty in thinking that the thought of an apple is not juicy, it's not this size, it's not, about 3 ounces in weight and stuff like that, because a thought is a thing that is non-physical. But also children, and we too, think that non-physical things have a physical effect because they drive behavior. when I was doing fieldwork, anthropological fieldwork in Cameroon, I sometimes asked people those questions about thoughts, and they said, yeah, of course, thoughts are somewhere in the head or the heart, but they're not the real thing, and they're not physical, and so on and so forth. But how come the desire, for example, to lift your arm results in you lifting your arm? And they thought the question was perfectly stupid. And everyone in the world thinks that question is really baffling and slightly stupid, except philosophers, who are trained into finding these things weird, but our spontaneous, evolved intuition is that, yes, there are non-physical things inside our heads that have physical effects on our bodies. That's the axiom. That's not something you have to demonstrate. But also, we have intuitive assumptions that start when we're young, but we also have them in a purely tacit way. We're not aware of them. That, for example, persons are continuous, that there's a certain identity of mind, such that what I told you yesterday is still somewhere in your mind, but it's not in the minds of other people, unless you told them. But also that there are stable preferences and capacities. If I see today that you prefer A to B, I kind of infer, I assume that you will prefer A to B, all else being equal tomorrow, because you'll still be the same person. Also, we have an assumption of mental coherence, which is that we have strong causal principles about how minds work. We think, for example, that perception, we never think about that explicitly, but we assume that perception causes beliefs, which cause desires, which cause intention, which cause action. And whenever we see evidence of the arrows going the other way, we find that deeply pathological. So that if someone has a belief that creates a perception, we think that's not normal. Okay, the mind is not working the same way. If someone tells you, I really like bananas so much that I see them, you think that person has a problem. Okay, all else being equal again. We also assume that there's great consistency in beliefs and desires. That is, even though it's not always the case, actually, we assume that people, if they desire X and they know that you cannot have X unless you do Y, will try to do Y. Okay, we expect that. So there's a whole lot of expectations like that are not conscious and that are driving our interaction all the time. This system is constantly activated whenever we interact with people. But the thing is that this system creates huge constraints on what fiction is possible. Like, for example, it makes the notion of a character, which is a stable, person-like agent with roughly stable preferences from one moment to the next, and a history of causation, that is, the memories in this person are caused by actual experiences and so on. That is something that we find in most societies in the world. People do not engage in fiction where the characters, that is, the agents, suddenly change preferences or change roles or change identities. It's crucial to maintain that. And why is that the case? Because it's the simplest way of telling a story, which is to assume, take for granted, and transfer all the assumptions you have about intuitive psychology, from intuitive psychology, all the tacit intuitions you have about the way mental systems work, you just transfer them to that fictive world, unless you have some information to the contrary. That is, violations of intuitive psychology, when they appear in fiction, must be flagged. So, for example, if you have a story, however weird that would seem, about a hero who only does what she doesn't want to do, then you have to say it, because no one will infer that from the narrative. On the other hand, if you have a character who does what they want in order to bring about what they prefer, you don't have to say it, because readers will, or listeners, will automatically transfer that. Also, the notions of plotline and causation in fiction are pretty constraining, and they're taken from intuitive psychology. There are plots that are natural and plots that are unnatural. And what I mean by that is the plots that are natural are the ones that are culturally successful because people have absolutely no problem following them and understanding what is going on. Also, the stability of preferences, the desired behavior consistency. Here I must say that people will tell me, no, that's not the case, because there's lots of modernist literature that doesn't do that at all. And there's an ironic piece by Jorge Luis Borges that talks about that, where Borges, ironically, of course, piling up layers of irony upon layers of irony, says that literature used to be good, like the 1001 Nights. This is good literature. There's a plot, it makes sense. Each of the stories has to be consistent. The heroes have to do exactly what they need to do given their situation. Everything works. And then you have the Russian novels, where people kill because they love, or they leave someone because they want to be with them, or things like that. And Borges says, well, that's cheap, because that's just a way, if you have no idea what to do with your plot, to make it work anyway. Okay, but that's Borges. But what I have to say about modernism, it's true that when you read Ulysses, you have a counterexample to everything I said here. But that's why there's only one of Ulysses, and that's why it has so few readers, and why so many of the readers are frustrated, and so on and so forth. Okay. But all this is fine, but it tells us, okay, so you have an evolved mind with its social intelligence, and it makes your fiction of a certain kind. But it still hasn't explained, why do people pay attention? Why would they want to buy these things? Why do they have pleasure in listening to the stories? So what about the motivation? Well then, at this point, most evolutionary anthropologists or psychologists would have two kinds of hypotheses. And it's very difficult to say which one is supported by more of the evidence. Excuse me. One is the byproduct hypothesis, which is that we have adaptations, we have dispositions. Like, for example, if you are a frog, or if I am a frog, we need to feed on insects. So we have a disposition to attend to anything that looks like insects, like all fast-moving small objects. Now, as it happens, we have a social mind and social dispositions. We need to pay attention to social interaction. That's a vital need for our survival. Okay, whoever in our ancestors did not pay much attention to social interaction is not among our ancestors. Okay, we are the descendants of the people who did pay attention, and also we are rewarded for paying attention. That's why gossip is pleasurable. It's an evolved sort of trait. Gossip is pleasurable because if we didn't have pleasure in exchanging information about sex, power, and status, and things like that among other people, we would have a much poorer view of our social world. It's like, why do we find sugar rewarding? Well, because it's something that we need, at least in the environments where we evolved. So we're rewarded for this sort of sugar of the mind that is social stuff. So the idea is that fiction mimics the features of social interactions. Plots have the feature of real social interactions. He wanted this, she wanted that. He enlisted the help of someone else. She, ran away. This sounds like real social interaction. So the idea is that our minds are tricked. This is a bit like I'm sorry, man. About these things. Our minds are tricked, and it's just a byproduct. So the idea is that some people have said that fiction is candy for the mind, for the social mind, and that's very much the idea. That in the same way as we used to have a real need to gorge ourselves with fat and sugar when we encountered it in ancestral environments, because those things were rare. But now we have cake shops, so those things are kind of disastrous. But at the same time, cakes are wonderful, they're delicious. And the idea is that fiction is candy for the mind. That's the byproduct idea. So there is no intrinsic fitness advantage in being interested in fiction. It just happens that our minds are tricked by that. The problem about that is that it has some limitations. One problem is that we invest too much energy and effort in getting fiction. We have too much reward for it to be a perfectly neutral thing. It's a very expensive thing to do. We spend time that we could spend doing other things, listening to stories about characters, people who do not exist. So maybe there's too much investment. There may be something that we get out of that. So some people are saying, well, it is a form of training, maybe, and that's why we're disposed to love it. Oh, I'm sorry. This is... If we have a training hypothesis, what we're saying is that this is very much like play. I mean, anyone who's seen human babies can tell you that they keep going at it like this, like they're in a gym. And actually, they are in a gym. They have to build muscle, and the only way to build muscle is to go on like this, 24/7, at least, 2 hours out of 24, and sleep the rest of the time. But that's what you're doing. And it is pleasurable, in the same way as play is pleasurable for all mammals, and we are no exception. We love to play, and we play at things like chasing, and so on and so forth, which are a form of training. We train ourselves constantly by investing tens of thousands of hours doing something for the pure fun of doing it. Something that tells us that maybe the training hypothesis is onto something is that, as you know, lots of children have imaginary companions, imaginary friends, and that used to be thought of as a kind of pathology, that, it's, my child has an imaginary friend. I would much rather she had a real friend. So what's wrong with her? Well, actually, developmental psychologists, and especially Marjorie Taylor, who studied this phenomena, showed that children who have imaginary companions, because not a lot of them do it, children who have imaginary companions are actually much better earlier than other kids at solving social intelligence problems, social interaction problems. In other words, they get training from interacting with someone who's not around, okay? And it's confirmed also by the fact that imaginary companions are not pure fantasies that always obey what you want. Indeed, most kids who have imaginary companions say that it's pretty tough because the imaginary friend does not want to cross the road with you. So you have to convince them. Okay, they don't want to go have ice cream with you. You have to tell them what. So it could be that fiction represents some form of training in social interaction, which is very good news for the humanities and humanities department, because it predicts two things. Because of two things. One is that it predicts that people who've read more fiction, and especially more of the complicated kind, will be better at social intelligence. And I think that's true. I don't have the scientific evidence, but I think that's true. More cultured people are actually better understanding social interaction simply because they've seen a lot of it, much more than they have through their lives. They've seen lots of it in Jane Austen, and that is very good training for them. So we need humanities department to train people in social intelligence. So we've rescued the humanities. That's one thing. This is Calvin and Hobbes, as you may know. It's the story about him in a imaginary companion. So let's move on to some other domains where we see this kind of creativity out of constrained minds, constrained by evolution. And I'll talk about nonsense ideologies for 2 minutes, just because it's getting late, so I need to offend people so people don't fall asleep. So I'll talk about some of these things that people might think of as not as nonsense ideologies. So homeopathy is a perfect example of something that is culturally successful, partly because of the kinds of minds we all have by virtue of evolution. And I'll tell you why. The story, as you know, of homeopathy is that the initial theory by Hahnemann was based on two tenets, as it were. One is that same has an effect on same. That is something that triggers fevers will be relevant for fevers, but also of dilution, so that if you dilute things billions of times, then you have the reverse effect, so that you can cure fevers by quinine when it's diluted. And you dilute those things a great number of times. Okay. So, of course, chemists say when you've diluted something to that extent, you don't have the something in the thing. Okay, yeah, that's it. Why does that spread? I'm not here to say whether it's true, untrue, or whatever, but why does it spread? Well, it seems to me, first of all, it did spread because it's a worldwide phenomenon, and there's that, well-known $20 million duck that is used. One of the homeopathic medicines is an extract of duck liver, but it's so diluted 100 billion times, that in order to produce the entire production in the United States, which last year made $20 million, all you would need is one duck and one liver. So that's what people call it, the $20 million duck. If you get that duck, you have this thing. Okay. So why does that spread? Well, we happen to have something in our evolved psychology that is present in lots of different ways in different cultures that is about something almost like homeopathy. We have theories and intuitions about contagion. Now, there are very different cultural theories about contagion and pathogens. In some places, like in China, people would tell you that you shouldn't breathe near a sick person because they exhale bad air. There is a theory of miasma in some cultures. We, of course, have the Western biomedical theory about microbes. Where I did fieldwork, people had a theory about invisible darts that are sent by sick people and that penetrate inside the veins and the arteries and make your blood very thick. Okay, you can have all sorts of theories like that, but there are common intuitions behind those theories. The intuition that illness is transmissible as opposed to accidents. An intuition that contact is dangerous. And an intuition that there's no way to detect the real state. Oops. The real state of the organism. Now, why do we have those intuitions? It happens that we are humans, and like rats, we are food generalists. We eat more or less all the nutrients that we can find in our environments. And this has several consequences. One of them is that we eat lots of natural vegetables, which is one of the worst things you could do, because natural vegetables are very bad for you, because they're full of toxins. They have toxins because they have to repel predators, like insects. We also eat meats, which being, a very natural thing, are very bad for you, because they're full of bacteria. So we have to have systems that direct us to behavior that takes that into account. We have to detect the pathogenic danger, and sometimes we have direct reactions that do that work, like gut reactions, disgust. So if you see this thing, I hope you can see it in all its festering glory. If you see this thing on the side of the road, you don't think, wow, free lunch, I'll just take it home. You leave it there, and rats and humans are very good at learning that kind of thing. Oh, sorry, these things keep... We have these intuitions that... we have this system that tells us that something is disgusting, but also we have a very good learning system. For example, we can learn disgust, like rats do, actually, from other people. And from seeing someone vomit after they ate some of this pork, you can acquire a gut reaction of your own. So this is a learning system that, you get information from others. Now, there are three intuitive... Doesn't matter. There are three intuitive principles that we have. One is that the vector of bad stuff, like diseases, is invisible. The second one is that there's multiple channels of transmission, so any form of contact is bad. And the third one is that the dose doesn't matter, by which, I will try to illustrate that, but what I mean by that is that if I tell you that I put a little bit of pepper in the stew, and you hate pepper, black pepper, you'll say, oh God, that's a pity, because I really hate that. And if I say, well, but it's only, tiny amount, you'll say, okay, that's all right. But imagine I say it's poop that I put in the stew, and you say, well, you know what, or vomit, and you say, you know what, I don't like that stuff in my stew, and I say, no, but it's only a half spoonful, it's not that much. I'm sure you'd say, no, it doesn't work. So we have intuitive constraints on this system. Paul Rosin, who's a psychologist at Penn, is famous for doing all sorts of weird experiments with people, one of which is to ask them to either put on a sweater that used to be Hitler's sweater, and people in general, do not want to do it. They think there's something contagious about Hitler's sweater, and they really don't want to wear it. If they're told that it's a sweater that was knitted by the same person who knitted Hitler's sweater, then but they're still not good. If you ask them to drink from a glass that's got a cockroach in it, if it's a real cockroach, they really don't want it. If it's a plastic cockroach, they still are not, really tempted. If it's a glass where there used to be a cockroach, they're still sort of reluctant. So you have all those magical transmission effects. But all these make sense. And the homeopathic claims are a bit like that too. There's a counterintuitive claim in homeopathy, which is that the same does the opposite. So that's what attracts your attention. In order to make you recover from this snake bite, we'll have to give you some of the snake. And that seems like there's some difficulty there. So it's attention grabbing. But there's also a very intuitive claim, which is that there's minute invisible substances that do act on people. And that we have this sort of magical or precaution psychology inside our minds. So that makes this sort of cultural story very, very successful. Now, in order to offend the maximum number of people, I wanted to talk about psychoanalysis as the same kind of thing. It's most successful, it's very successful, but successful what? It's very difficult to say. It's not really a therapy because most people aren't cured of anything if they had anything to start with. It's not really a cult, although it's kind of a cult, but it's not really a cult. We don't know, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that it's kind of shamanism. We have others have shamanism. We used to have psychoanalysis, and it was very popular. There's elements of guru-like transmission in psychoanalysis, and you all know that kind of stuff. There's absolutely no scientific testing or evidence for any of the claims, but those claims are very popular. And as distinct, there's a sort of Lacan stuff, just in case you wanted some French stuff, here it is. But, this is the theology of psychoanalysis. No one who does psychoanalysis actually knows that stuff. And I'm quite sure that everyone who knows that stuff has no idea what it means, but that's okay. But the claims were very popular. And why are they popular? The claims are that the claim, there's a sort of bait in this theory, which is the counterintuitive claim that we have conscious deliberation is not driving behavior. Okay? That is, what you think you want, you don't actually want it. There's some other bit of you that you're not aware of that wants things. Okay? That's very sort of counterintuitive and a bit sort of puzzling. And also that sex is pervading mental function. And you tend to think, well, yes, sure, but the reason I want to have more muffins is it's nothing to do with sex. Yes, it has to do with sex. So, that's a bit sort of counterintuitive. But then there's the switch. There's the bait and switch. Because once you've found those things very interesting, you're attracted and you realize that the entire system is very intuitive. It's very simple to understand. Because the homunculus that's inside your mind, that's called the unconscious in that theory, it's a little person. It's not at all like generative syntax, which is a little thing inside your mind, but no one has the foggiest idea how it works. And when you describe how it works, people say, what? No, it's a little person that wants things. It's a devious little agent that forces you to do things. Freud has immensely interesting passages where he says, well, the unconscious then realizes that he can't do it this way, that he does it the another way. And, that's perfectly good for us. That's what we are evolved to process, this kind of thing. So there's a combination of attention-grabbing, counterintuitive, potential stuff, and inferentially rich, very easy sort of things. This is where the homunculus is, actually. This is the unconscious, if you want to see it. Okay, I've taken way too much time, so I will move on to something. I will not talk about religion, but I will just finish with this. In both cases, we have constraints. That is, these culturally successful fads and fallacies You can't explain them by generative principles. What I mean is that there is no logic in the mind that would predict that you will create homeopathy or psychoanalysis or most religious ideologies. But you can have a selective explanation, which is that once those things are around, they're very good for human minds, because human minds find them both attractive. Okay? The material attracts attention, and it gets processed. But also it's minimally coherent, so you can recall it. And also it triggers inferences. If you have an unconscious in your mind that is trying to make you trip up and say obscene things to people, then you can predict what you should do, and you know what's going to happen. And you can explain what happened in some cases. So this is a very sort of general sort of claim that I want to make about those culturally creative things. Just like those nonsense ideologies, or just like fiction. The best explanation for the fact that we have highly original, unpredictable phenomena there is that we have a rich psychology that is richly constrained by evolution, by natural selection, and is so rich and complex that it has scope for all these, it provides us with dispositions for all those interesting sort of phenomena. And I will stop there. Thank you.